Ever notice how a single phrase from someone can poison your entire day? What if the truth is that feeling only survives 90 seconds unless you choose to keep it alive? Here's what you need to understand. The majority of your pain doesn't originate from their action. It originates from your unwillingness to release it. You practice the offense. You run the scenario again. You transform a fleeting instant into lifelong imprisonment. And the brutal reality is you're gripping the keys. Why does one thoughtless remark burn inside your consciousness for endless hours? Why does another person's silence cut through you like treachery? Because you've conditioned your consciousness to be reactive instead of reflective. And while you're consumed with being wounded, the individuals who triggered you have already moved forward, unbothered, oblivious. The ancient Stoics recognized this snare intimately. If you're exhausted from being emotionally commandeered by things unworthy of your tranquility, this content will disrupt everything you believe about rage, insult, and authority. If you think your internal reality deserves greater sovereignty than disorder, consider subscribing for that aspect of yourself prepared to transcend the disturbance, prepared to select composure, not because existence becomes simpler, but because you become more formidable. People claim the initial wound cuts deepest, but reality reveals it's the subsequent, repeated injuries that truly inflict destruction. The opening flash of rage is merely ignition. Biologically speaking, it's a chemical cascade, your organism's primitive warning mechanism responding to detected danger. But your subsequent actions determine the outcome. Most individuals don't simply experience the anger, they nourish it. They tend it like an injury, replaying that disrespectful statement endlessly inside their minds, until it evolves into a comprehensive story. They construct what they should have articulated, how they should have countered, what they'll express next encounter. And through this process, they're not merely reliving the transgression, they're re-injuring themselves continuously. It resembles being stung by an insect and then deliberately stinging yourself repeatedly for the following 6 hours. But here's what brain science and Stoic teachers reveal. That original biological surge of fury persists approximately 90 seconds, just 90. Beyond that, everything else becomes mental repetition, emotional dependency, the decision to maintain grip. And that's where authority emerges. Because if it constitutes a decision, then it can be undecided. Seneca observed once, "The supreme cure for rage is postponement." He didn't advocate suppression. He didn't suggest ignoring it or acting like it's absent. He advocated delay. Grant it distance, because what exists within that distance is precision. Reaction demands immediacy. It demands you respond now, to shout now, to intensify now. But if you grant yourself even a single breath, a suspension between the spark and your initial utterance, what you'll discover is that most of the intensity diminishes independently. You'll perceive the distinction between the occurrence and the narrative you were constructing around it. You'll perceive how effortlessly you were about to surrender your tranquility to something transient and insignificant. There's a silent form of understanding in that suspension, a strength most individuals never access because they've persuaded themselves that rage equals strength, that volume equals authority. But those are deceptions. Genuine strength is limitation, not from fear, but from conviction. The Stoics didn't merely aim to govern anger. They aimed to be immune to it, not in a mechanical manner, but in a profoundly human manner. They maintained that emotion should serve reason, not dominate it. So when something disturbs you, the objective isn't to feel nothing. The objective is to feel everything, but respond like someone who possesses themselves. And possessing yourself begins with comprehending that emotions are merely indicators, not commands. They dissolve if you permit them. The difficulty is that we seldom do. We attach to them. We attribute significance to them. We declare, "I'm still furious," because what they executed was incorrect. But the reality is what they executed was an instant. What you're still executing is a decision, and that differentiation, that minute shift in consciousness, is everything. Carl Jung stated, "Everything that provokes us about others can guide us to comprehension of ourselves, and perhaps that's the genuine opportunity in rage. Not to release it, but to investigate it, to question, why did this impact me so intensely? What aspect of me was contacted that I haven't fully examined yet?" Because rage is rarely about the exterior. It's rarely about what was articulated or executed. It's about the significance you assigned it, and what that significance reveals about what you still carry. An injury, a conviction, an ancient narrative that never genuinely healed. So instead of intensifying the blaze, what if you remained with it, observed it, permitted it to instruct you instead of consume you? Epictetus reminded us, it is not occurrences that disturb us, but our interpretation about them. That statement should reverberate in your consciousness every occasion your chest constricts with fury, every occasion your fists clench, and your contemplations accelerate, because that's the instant, that's the decision junction. You can surrender your authority to the interpretation, or you can return to the occurrence itself, stripped of all the significance you've constructed on top of it. Most things, when reduced to their fundamental facts, aren't worthy of the emotional burden we assign them. A postponed response, an overlooked message, a vocal tone. These aren't weapons unless you decide to be wounded. So when it arrives, when that surge of intensity rises in your chest, remember this: if you execute nothing, it will dissolve. If you wait, if you breathe, if you select not to add combustion, it extinguishes independently. 90 seconds. That's the duration. Not to repair the reality, not to transform them, but to return to yourself, to maintain the boundary. And in that action, in that simple refusal to abandon yourself over something you cannot govern, you become something exceptional, not reactive, not emotionally hijacked, but anchored, motionless, powerful, stoic. It's convenient to declare someone else constitutes the difficulty, that their utterances, their manner, their behaviors are the explanation you feel injured, enraged, disrespected. It's convenient because it's instinctive. We observe externally for the source of our discomfort because that's where the activation seems to reside. But the truth is far less convenient and far more liberating. They didn't construct the mechanism, they just located it. The mechanism was already present, constructed by years of experiences, convictions, and emotional wounds you haven't fully investigated. When someone articulates something that impacts you intensely, it's not because they're powerful. It's because you've unknowingly granted them access to something sensitive, something unhealed. That sarcastic comment or passive criticism only penetrates because it contacted a bruise that already existed. A bruise from being rejected in the past. A bruise from not feeling acknowledged. The reaction belongs to you, and that's not an accusation. It's an invitation, because if the pain is yours, then so is the authority to transform it. We navigate existence thinking we're walking around with a remote control in someone else's possession that they activate and we react. But that's only accurate if the connection is functioning. Sever the connection and they activate all they desire. Nothing occurs. Marcus Aurelius expressed it plainly. If you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your estimation of it. What he was addressing is radical possession, not for condemnation, but for liberation. You can't stop individuals from being who they are. You can't govern what they articulate, but you can govern the significance you grant it, the narrative you construct around it. And that narrative is where all your suffering or your tranquility exists. When someone activates your mechanisms, the natural response is to retaliate or withdraw. But what if instead you became curious? What if, instead of declaring they made me feel this manner, You questioned, why does this affect me so profoundly? That question doesn't just transform the instant, it transforms your entire relationship with pain. You stop being the passive recipient of emotional destruction and start becoming the investigator of your own activation. That doesn't make the other individual correct. It just makes you responsible for your internal reality. And that's a responsibility that leads to emotional strength, because no one can activate what you've healed. No one can injure what you've outgrown. Carl Jung once stated, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your existence, and you will call it destiny." That's what your mechanisms are. They're unconscious programs constructed in childhood, reinforced by past injuries, and rarely questioned until now. When you make them conscious, you reclaim the remote. You're no longer reacting from ancient pain. You're responding from present consciousness. And that consciousness is authority. It's the distance between the stimulus and your response. It's the capacity to observe someone's behavior and declare, "That's theirs, not mine." It's the capability to maintain your position without getting pulled into the disorder they're attempting to project. There will always be individuals who test your patience, who activate ancient narratives, who attempt to shake your equilibrium. But those individuals are not in governance of you. They never were. What's in governance is your own interpretation of the instant, your own emotional history, your own unresolved fragments. And that's not a weakness. It's a chart. Every occasion someone gets under your exterior, they're showing you exactly where to observe, exactly where to develop. Instead of perceiving them as the adversary, what if you perceived them as the reflection? Not a reflection of who you are, but a reflection of what still needs your attention. Epictetus stated, "Any individual capable of angering you becomes your master. He can anger you only when you permit yourself to be disturbed by him." That's the essence of it. Emotional liberation begins when you stop distributing the keys to your tranquility. It begins when you stop letting individuals reside rent-free in your consciousness. When you realize that being offended isn't a reflex, it's a decision, one that you can make differently. You can select to suspend, to observe, to respond with precision instead of reactivity. There's no necessity to be rigid or cold to execute this. This isn't about constructing walls or pretending you don't care. It's about constructing boundaries, not around your heart, but around your interpretation. It's about realizing that your emotional existence is yours to manage, not theirs to dictate. You can care about someone profoundly and still not let their negative mood contaminate your own. You can disagree without letting it define your entire day. You can listen to criticism without letting it dismantle your sense of self. Seneca wrote, "He who is angry at the things which happen is like a canine barking at a stone." That's what it resembles when you keep blaming others for what you're feeling, like barking at something that will never transform, never respond, never grant you tranquility. The work, the genuine work, is internal. It's in comprehending that emotional mastery isn't about getting others to stop activating your mechanisms. It's about disarming them altogether. You don't need to become indifferent to stop being reactive. You just need to become conscious. Consciousness creates distance, and distance grants you space to select. That instant between being activated and selecting your reaction, that's the instant where authority exists. That's where you reclaim the remote back into your own possession, not to silence the reality, but to master your own volume, to decide how loud you want other individuals' disturbance to be inside your own consciousness. And the more you practice that, the quieter it becomes, the less they activate. Because eventually, there's nothing remaining to activate. The tranquility you're searching for isn't out there. It's in here, in the silent distance between stimulus and response, in the simple action of not surrendering control, in realizing that your mechanisms are not who you are. They are who you've been. And once you perceive them clearly, you can start becoming someone new, someone who doesn't just discuss tranquility, but lives it quietly, consistently, powerfully, stoically. Rage feels powerful. It surges through the organism like combustion, intense, rapid, blinding. In the instant, it makes you feel alive, powerful, untouchable. It persuades you that you're in governance, that you're standing your position, that you're not the one being injured. You're the one executing the injuring. But most occasions, that's just the exterior. That's the disguise. Underneath all that intensity is something much colder, much quieter, and far more vulnerable. The rage that erupts isn't usually the original emotion. It's a defense, a covering, a shield for something that feels too raw to expose. And the truth is, the more reactive your rage is, the more likely it's concealing something you don't want to confront. Think about the final occasion you snapped at someone. Maybe it was a remark that caught you unprepared, or a manner that felt disrespectful. But if you decelerate the instant down and strip it to its essence, there's often something deeper buried beneath that outburst. Maybe it wasn't disrespect, it was rejection. Maybe it wasn't just annoyance, it was fear of being misunderstood. When we explode in rage, we rarely question ourselves, what am I actually protecting right now? Because it's easier to be enraged than it is to be vulnerable. It's easier to raise your voice than to admit that something pierced your sense of value. But if you observe closely, that's what most rage is. A desperate attempt to avoid feeling the more painful emotion underneath. Irritation is often the surface-level cousin of something more important. When someone criticizes you, it may penetrate because it echoes a voice you've already internalized. Maybe it sounds like a parent who was never satisfied, a teacher who always pointed out your flaws, a partner who made you question your value. These echoes exist inside us, and when someone activates them, we don't always recognize the original source. Instead, we snap at the messenger. The rage isn't about them. It's about everything that came before them. The instant contact's a bruise we never truly healed, and instead of feeling the pain, we turn it outward. That's why Stoicism doesn't request us to suppress emotion. It requests us to investigate it, to decelerate it, to get underneath it. Because once you comprehend what's fueling your rage, you're no longer ruled by it. You don't have to act from it. You can remain with it, learn from it, and select a better response. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When you are offended at any man's fault, turn to yourself and study your own failings. Then you will forget your anger." That's not about condemnation. It's about comprehension. It's about realizing that most of our rage is less about justice and more about personal pain. And the longer we wear that disguise of fury, the more disconnected we become from the truth inside us. The irony is that the more we pretend rage makes us powerful, the more fragile we actually become. Because if you need rage to feel powerful, then your authority is dependent on being provoked. And that means you're not in governance at all. Genuine strength doesn't come from being reactive. It comes from precision, from knowing exactly what you're feeling and why, from having the self-consciousness to declare, "I'm not enraged because of what they articulated. I'm enraged because it reminded me of something I haven't dealt with yet." That level of honesty is rare, but it's the kind that transforms you, not just in the instant, but in your existence. Epictetus once stated, "If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your consciousness is complicit in the provocation." That can be difficult to accept, because it shifts the responsibility back to you. But that's where your authority exists, in the distance, where you stop blaming and start investigating. That's the beginning of emotional liberation. Not just liberation from others, but liberation from the unconscious patterns that keep repeating themselves through you. The patterns that make you feel like you're always being attacked, when really You're just always being reminded. Seneca, too, warned against trusting the first wave of emotion. He wrote, "Anger, if not restrained, is frequently more hurtful to us than the injury that provokes it." And you can feel this in your own existence. How many occasions have you reacted in rage only to regret what you articulated or executed later? How often has your response executed more destruction than the original offense? That's the cost of unexamined emotion. That's what occurs when we let the disguise do the talking instead of confronting what's underneath. But once you perceive rage for what it truly is, a messenger, not a master, you can approach it differently. You can meet it with curiosity instead of fear. You can suspend and question, what's really transpiring inside me right now? That suspension is everything. It interrupts the automatic pattern. It grants you an instant to select instead of react. And every occasion you make that selection, you chip away at the illusion that you are your rage. You're not. You're the one watching it rise and fall. You're the one deciding what to execute next. Socrates once stated, "The unexamined existence is not worth living." And in the realm of emotion, that couldn't be more accurate. If you never question your reactions, you'll live your whole existence being pulled by them, governed by them, defined by them. But if you observe beneath the disguise, you'll discover a deeper truth, one that doesn't need to shout, one that doesn't need to defend, one that simply comprehends, and in comprehension becomes unshakable. Rage will still arrive. You're human. You feel. You care. But it doesn't have to possess you. It doesn't have to wear your face and speak in your voice. It can arrive, and you can let it dissolve like a wave you perceive rising on the horizon. You don't have to combat it. You just have to stand motionless long enough to let it wash over without knocking you down. That's the manner of the Stoic, not to be emotionless, but to be masterful, to feel everything and still respond with intention. That's not weakness. That's not avoidance. That's the kind of authority that doesn't need to be loud to be genuine. And the more you practice it, the less you'll need the disguise. Because what's underneath isn't weakness, it's truth. And truth, when confronted with courage, is stronger than any combustion. Most individuals exist as if their reactions are automatic, like lightning after thunder. Something occurs, and without thinking, they snap, lash out, withdraw, or spiral. It's so rapid, so familiar, that it doesn't even feel like a selection. But it is, always between what occurs and what you execute about it. There's a fragment of silence, an invisible distance, and inside that distance is everything. Your tranquility, your precision, your authority. But most individuals never discover it, not because it's concealed, but because they've never searched for it. Existence rushes them past that instant. Emotion hijacks them before they realize they've crossed the boundary between consciousness and reaction. Yet that fleeting suspension is the only location where genuine liberation exists. When someone interrupts you in conversation, when your partner articulates something insensitive, when a stranger gives you a contemptuous look, your organism will react. Your heart rate may elevate. Your breath may shorten. A flood of emotion might surge into your chest. But what occurs next is entirely up to you. You can respond immediately, or you can wait. You can let your instinct operate the show, or you can let your intention take the control. That selection occurs in a blink, and if you miss it, you end up articulating things you don't mean, executing things you later regret, and wondering how you lost your grip on yourself again. But if you discover it, if you learn to step into that distance, it transforms everything, because that's where you stop reacting like a puppet and start responding like an individual with agency. Viktor Frankl, a man who endured unthinkable suffering in concentration camps, once wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose." He didn't declare that distance would always feel comfortable or obvious or easy to reach, but it's always there. And the more you practice noticing it, the larger it gets. What begins as half a second becomes a full breath, then two, then a suspension long enough to reframe the entire situation. That enraged text you were about to transmit suddenly doesn't feel necessary. That defensive remark you were preparing doesn't sound so wise. And without executing anything else, you just transformed your entire trajectory by executing nothing at all. The Stoics called this mastery of the self, not a cold detachment, but a clear refusal to be ruled by impulse. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That's the reminder we all need, because most individuals exist like they have no authority over anything, as if emotions are facts and reactions are destiny. But the instant you step into that suspension, you realize you're not bound by the chain of occurrences. You can break the link. You can select a different response than the one your rage, fear, or pride demands. And that selection over and over again is what constructs character. It's easy to misunderstand this, to think that restraint means weakness, that walking away means surrender. But in truth, it's the opposite. The strongest individuals are not the ones who shout the loudest or strike back the fastest. They're the ones who can remain in the intensity of emotion and not let it govern their hands or their utterances. They're the ones who can be insulted and still remain composed because they've trained themselves to return to that distance between activation and response. They don't react out of ego. They respond out of conviction. And in executing, so they become the composure in the tempest, the unmoved in the disorder. Carl Jung once stated, what we do not make conscious appears in our existences as destiny, that unconscious pull to react instantly, to meet aggression with aggression, isn't destiny, it's habit. And habits can be transformed, but first, they must be perceived. That's why the suspension matters so profoundly. It interrupts the autopilot. It grants you the chance to make something conscious, to question, what narrative am I telling myself right now? Because your reaction doesn't come from the situation itself. It comes from the significance you assign to it. A harsh manner becomes disrespect. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A disagreement becomes treachery. But those are narratives, and you get to edit the script. That's what the suspension grants you, a seat in the writer's position. Epictetus taught that no one can injure you without your consent, that the insult isn't in the utterances, it's in how you receive them. And this isn't just theory. You felt it before. Think of an occasion when someone attempted to provoke you and it didn't function, not because they were kind, but because you were grounded. You were present enough to suspend, to perceive through their utterances and stay steady in yourself. That wasn't luck. That was you accessing your distance. That was self-governance dressed in stillness. It doesn't mean you'll get it perfect every occasion. You'll still have instants where emotion slips past you, where the reaction arrives too rapidly and leaves you wishing you'd handled it differently. That's part of the practice. But even in those instants, you can learn, you can reflect, you can question, where was the distance and what kept me from it? The more you execute that, the sharper your consciousness becomes. You start to perceive the wave before it crashes. You feel the urge to respond too rapidly. And remember, you don't have to. Seneca once wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." And in many manners, the distance between activation and response is where that adversity exists, not in the external reality, but in the internal one. The challenge isn't what occurs, it's what occurs inside you. And the response you select is the proof of your development. It's where you show yourself who you're becoming. There will always be disturbance, always pressure, always individuals who test your patience, challenge your ego, stimulate ancient injuries, but they don't possess the script. You execute. And the more you practice stepping into that suspension, the more you reclaim your role as the author. One breath, one heartbeat, one distance between stimulus and response. That's all it takes to become untouchable, not because nothing can reach you, but because you've learned how to meet it all with presence, with poise, with authority. And in that instant, you don't just respond differently, you become different. Rage only has the authority to take over when you believe that it's you, that it's who you are. But you are not your rage. You're not your frustration, your anxiety, your sadness, or your fear. You are the one who experiences those things, not the things themselves. That's a massive distinction, and it's the explanation why some individuals can walk through disorder with composure while others get knocked over by every breeze. Most individuals get swept away because they've never learned to separate themselves from what they're feeling. They don't know how to witness the tempest without stepping into it. But once you comprehend that your consciousness is always bigger than the emotion inside it, you step into a new kind of authority, one that doesn't need to combat the feeling because it knows it's not the feeling. When rage starts to rise, when your jaw tightens, your chest tightens, your breathing shifts, your first instinct is often to follow it, to execute something, to articulate something. But what if you didn't? What if instead of obeying that emotion, you just noticed it? You observed the intensity without feeding it. You watched it rise and then watched it fall. That shift, as small as it sounds, is everything. It's the distinction between being trapped and being liberated, because emotions are temporary. They arrive and depart. But the observer in you, the one who perceives it all, that's the constant. That's the anchor. The sky doesn't rage when the clouds pass through. It just remains motionless and open, letting whatever needs to pass. You're like that. You don't have to scream just because something is screaming inside you. You don't have to react just because the emotion wants you to. You can suspend. You can breathe. You can declare, I notice I'm feeling this, without being consumed by it. And that subtle shift from identification to observation is where composure is born. Not because existence suddenly gets easier, but because you're no longer mistaking the weather for the sky. Carl Jung believed that the capacity to observe oneself is the foundation of psychological development. He once stated, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." And awakening in this sense is about becoming conscious of your own patterns, perceiving them play out in real time, and declaring, I don't need to follow this one again. That's what being the observer is. It's not detachment in the cold sense. It's compassionate distance, a willingness to witness your own emotional waves without getting dragged under by them. And that capacity is not just powerful, it's peaceful. It's not that you stop caring, it's that you stop being possessed by what you care about. You start responding to existence from a location of center, instead of letting every outside situation pull you off equilibrium. And you can feel the distinction. You know when you're caught in the emotion, and you know when you're just watching it. One feels frantic and loud, the other feels spacious and quiet. When you're the observer, nothing possesses you, not even the strongest emotion. You become like a mountain, motionless and grounded even as the wind howls around you. But make no mistake, this takes practice. It doesn't arrive from reading a statement or watching content. It arrives from noticing the instance when your organism tenses, when your contemplations accelerate, and then making the conscious decision to watch instead of react. That practice constructs muscle, emotional muscle, and eventually what used to overwhelm you becomes just another wave in the ocean. You stop fearing it. You stop needing to govern it. You just let it move through. And in executing so, you discover a liberation that no reaction could ever grant you. Seneca stated, "A wise man is indifferent to everything which he cannot control, and emotions, while they arise naturally, only govern you if you don't recognize them. for what they are. Contemplations with energy, sensations with narratives, but not permanent, not truths, and certainly not who you are. The wise man doesn't repress what he feels. He just doesn't mistake it for reality. He maintains distance for it. He lets it visit, but doesn't let it take over the house. The more you develop this relationship with your emotions, this gentle witnessing, the less you need to combat them. You don't have to suppress, argue, or run. You just become motionless. And in that stillness, everything shifts. You become less reactive, more present, less chaotic, more clear. And individuals will notice it, not because you tell them, but because they'll feel it in the manner you move, the manner you speak, the manner you respond. When others lose governance, you become the composed one, the one who doesn't rise with every tide. This isn't some ideal you'll reach perfectly. There will be days where you fall into ancient patterns, but the distinction is now you'll perceive it, you'll catch it faster. And the more you catch it, the more you'll realize you were never the rage, you were never the anxiety, you were never the reaction. You were always the one watching, the one selecting, the one maintaining distance for something more powerful than disturbance consciousness. So the next occasion you feel that rush of emotion constructing, remember, you don't have to become it. You can just be with it, observe it, let it rise, let it fall, and trust that your stillness will outlast the tempest because it always executes. Most of us spend our existences attempting to avoid difficult individuals. We wish they would just disappear. The supervisor who micromanages every task, the family member who interrupts before we finish a sentence, the stranger who cuts us off and doesn't apologize. It's natural to perceive them as obstacles to tranquility, as irritants we have to endure until they leave us alone. But what if they're not in your manner at all? What if they are the manner? That's not just a